legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today we present part 2 with Claire Rae Randall discussing her book, The War on Gender, Postmodernism and Trans Identity. As exposed in part 1 of our interview, transgender rights have recently come to the fore as a social issue, and yet there are many who feel that this is being pushed too far and too fast. It has gone from being a marginal issue to one that is now having a disproportionate influence on social values. However, the radical trans activist agenda to devalue, disrupt, and even destroy social and cultural institutions and replace them with nothing but chaos and confusion seems to make no sense. Evolved over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of human history, well-developed gender roles and archetypes, with very few exceptions, have allowed our species to adapt to wildly varying environments the world over, with plenty of room left for those who simply do not conform to majority gender patterns. So what's really going on? Delving deep into the dark side of the radical trans movement, we uncover a profoundly anti-human, anti-life agenda involving population reduction, transhumanism, and ultimately the end of the human race as we know it. Hello and welcome, Claire, and thank you so much for joining us again on legalizefreedom.com.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for having me back.
Well, it's only a few weeks since you and I did our first interview based on your new book, The War on Gender, Postmodernism and Trans Identity, but there was so much left untouched and unsaid by that first interview, and also you and I both wanted to expand even beyond the scope of your book into a lot of other deep and dark dimensions of what's happening in the world at the moment.
Yeah.
If people want to know about your background, your personal story, which is all laid out in your book, they can find a summary basically by going back to our first interview. I'll simply say that you were born male and that you transitioned during the 1980s, and that's all deeply relevant to all of this, but we're not going to go over that ground again.
Mm-hmm. Plus also, Greg, of course, there's an immense amount of this. About the first 2/5 of the book is about my personal, life journey before I get into the kind of, theoretical sides and political and all that sort of stuff. So there's a tremendous amount of there in the book already.
Yes, it's as you say, it's biographical and autobiographical and very, very, very compelling.
Thank you.
So, quoting from your book, you have said that the trans agenda, let's call it that, because pro, against, or somewhere in between, there's certainly agenda or agendas at play. And your quote is, "It has come from nowhere to become entirely dominant." And that is something that a lot of us have been, if not disturbed by, at least, we've raised an eyebrow and wondered why this, for all the need for all the improvements in equality and inclusivity that there has been over the last few decades and continuing progress in many areas, and welcome as that is, why this particular issue affecting such a small number of people has become such an enormous social issue, overshadowing issues of, other issues of sexuality and other issues of race and religion. It's completely blotted those out almost. I want to talk about some of what I see as radical political and social dimensions of what's happening. Mm-hmm. Now, what I see, and again, I find myself doing this sometimes, almost apologizing up in advance. I'm not going to do that at length, but we're not taking all and every topic, sub-movement, sub-interest group, and every individual that might come under trans and gender identity umbrella. and somehow saying there's an inherent problem with this. Not the point. We're simply focusing on certain aspects of it that are mysterious, to say the least, if not troubling.
Yes, indeed.
And what I see at work is a social engineering agenda. There are many of those at play in the world at the moment, but I see that in the trans agenda. And it seems to be about devaluing, disrupting, dismantling, and even destroying certain societal and cultural institutions, including the idea of binary gender, or, mostly, generally speaking, binary gender in humans and other mammals, and including the nuclear family, actually.
Yeah.
Anything that we describe as traditional. And I think we mentioned in our last interview, a lot of, traditional, there's this whole joke about you do something 3 times and it becomes a tradition.
Yes.
That doesn't make it good. So a lot of stuff that was traditional for centuries has been jettisoned, and rightly so. But not every, it's baby and bathwater situation, isn't it really? So, but we seem to be living in a culture, particularly in the West, of anything goes and nothing matters. And I don't think that anything does go, and I do think that some things do matter.
I think the thing is, as I say right at the beginning of the book, I'm very pleased, I'm very glad for the increased acceptance for gender divergent people like me that's taken place over the last 25 years or so. And that's all great, except the thing is that almost at the point where society had reached this level of acceptance, it then got appropriated and taken off in a completely different direction. Now, this is a direction which had actually been lurking in the background, because I mentioned in my book a conference I went to in 1975 at Easter, in which this whole issue was being discussed, and there was already at that time a distinction between people such as myself, who simply wanted to adjust their gender appearance and expression into being what we felt more comfortable with, and there were others who saw this as a political campaign, so that the boundaries of gender and sex would be made much more flexible, even eroded and destroyed. Now, this is really quite interesting, that actually, in a way, these 2 points of view are actually almost diametrically opposite. And so then, after I completed my transition in the late 80s, I just went on and I just got on with my life. I was in nursing, and I carried on that, and then I moved into teaching and further education, and I pretty much left the world of trans and LGB behind. But then in the early 2000s, I found reason to kind of reconnect with it. I heard that there was a Recognition Act going through, and I was astonished. Now, I think I mentioned about David Lammy and the Gender Recognition 2004 debates last week, so last time, so I don't need to go into it in any more detail. But if you do read those sections in my book, you'll see that this was an issue that was again revived in the early 2000s, and we were told that it would not be a problem, and yet as the years went by, now I remember it was about 2014 that things really started ramping up. And it's kind of interesting that also 2014 is about the time that a whole lot of other political issues, seemingly unrelated, also ramped up. And then I found that people in the LGBT world were speaking against me, even though I had been in what some call the kind of groundbreaker generation of the 80s. I mean, there were many before me in the 50s, 60s and 70s. But I suppose the 80s was a time when there was a lot of progress made. There was obviously much debate about Section 20-something or other, about gay issues in education. And already I think that this was kind of pushing things forward to a level where there was manufactured conflict. So that, there's always this thing that, the British like to fight for the underdog. So the moment people started feeling that, oh, gay people and trans people, they're being, they're being disadvantaged. So, of course, that, everybody wanted to get onto it, because this, I think, is something which is very much exploited. So, in more recent times, I found myself being treated as if, the word, we hear this word now, don't we? Transphobia. I am apparently transphobic because I don't have a blanket acceptance of anybody who simply claims some kind of variant gender identity. So I'm very much of the view that there has been political involvement with this. As far back as 2009, when I really started doing a deep dive into this, I was in close contact with the local gender studies department here in Leeds, which is very, very influential. It's one of the most high-profile ones. And I began to realise that they were promoting a view of transgender ideology which had literally nothing to do with me, because my own view was very much this was something that came out of my own developmental psychology, something I was born with, and they're completely into a social constructionist model, and I can only think that there has to be some kind of motivation behind this, because all the study I did about this as an undergraduate in psychology was very much based on the neurodevelopmental aspects of it, and other research has come to light, things like separated twin studies and so on and so forth. And then you find out a bit, then when I was researching the book, I found out about how Alinsky, what's his name, Saul Alinsky, who was interestingly a mentor of Hillary Clinton back in the 60s, and that he had actually written quite a lot about how to engage in, as you say, social engineering, and this is through, manipulating things like social guilt, so that if you feel like somebody's pointing out that you're in some way being unfair, then there's a general kind of feeling that you want to kind of get out of that accusation in some way. And if it's a continued social accusation, then one is going to feel like it is a general societal belief that you are in some way, going against. And so one is kind of cowered into a corner of believing or admitting or conforming to certain beliefs. And what Alinsky did, now he was very, very cunning and devious with this, because you may recall the section in the book where I mentioned this, where he wanted to exploit the fact that there were gay people around, but he wanted to use people gay people as a means of, basically he wanted to weaponize gay people, just like, trans people 20 years ago didn't want to be used as political tools to cause particular social directions. In the same way, I imagine that there was a lot of gay people who didn't want to be made high profile and all this. And yet, having done this, he then encouraged the gay community to get into the kind of world that is not really. I don't think it's really representative of a lot of gay people. I have gay friends who seem to have nothing to do with this very. I'm kind of trying to pick my words here so that I don't offend anybody, but I think you know what I mean. I mean, for instance, I'm thinking about people like Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray is gay, but he's conservative. He doesn't hold with the kind of culture that one tends to see in gay quarters on a Saturday night, So what I think what we're seeing now is a kind of modern extension of Alinsky's exploitation and manipulation of gay people from previous decades, and now it's being used to manipulate trans people or people who might not really have an idea of what this is about, but who perhaps just have mixed up kids, perhaps slightly variant sexuality, slightly variant gender identity, might be just able to just put it down to social causes, and then they turn this into a whole kind of social movement which entrains a lot of people who really wouldn't fit into the profile, but have, been entrained into it by the social pressure and the social engineering. Now, so this goes on to the next one. You're talking about destabilizing families. I mean, gay people have already been used for that for quite a long period of time. Again, this is an Alinsky thing. And it's very interesting that this is particularly prevalent in the West at the moment, and we're obviously getting pushback. More traditional cultures like Russia, they're very hostile to this because they see the political background to this, and they don't want their own societies to be destabilized in the way that seems to have happened in the West. And obviously it's not just gay, trans issues. There's all sorts of other ways that the West is being destabilized at the moment. So I can't possibly really see that this could just be some natural social development, because it is actual people like myself who need to pursue a path of complete gender reassignment. Really, I didn't, and most of those like myself, we don't see it as a political issue about society other than just finding a niche for ourselves.
Well, why should Douglas Murray, for example, feel that he has to be part of what some other subset of gay men might be doing or might be perceived as, or how they might be living? He should no more have to do that than I, as a heterosexual man, should have to feel like, I can be put in any other kind of subcategory with other heterosexual men who behave in myriad different ways.
Well, exactly. A very, very good example, yeah.
But it just so happens, I was going to say that heterosexual men aren't being, that isn't being weaponized, but of course it is. It seems that almost everything, every sort of cornerstone of our civilization is being weaponized,
well, yeah.
one against the other. But you mentioning Douglas Murray, actually, his new book, The War in the West. I don't know if you've read it yet, but many of the ideas.
I've read the previous one.
This builds on that in many ways. Many of the things that you've just been speaking about and that we've spoken about in the previous interview and will speak about it for the rest of this talk, that have overlaps with other radical movements seeking to undermine societal and cultural institutions, and it does seem to be about the West really. More than anything else. There are other things that are happening in other parts of the world and other cultures, but what we're mainly concerned with is the culture that we're part of.
If I can just make a little interjection there, what's very interesting about this, as you say, the West, is that places like Thailand and India have had trans cultures integrated into them for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they have not been destabilized over those hundreds or thousands of years in the way that our own society is being destabilized over a matter of decades.
Oh yeah, and that's clearly, this is what begs the question that we're asking, is what's this all about? What's this for? It's clearly not just about liberating some oppressed minorities, not at all, because it's doing anything but really at the end of the day, and it's also sucking in all sorts of people that are not and probably will never be genuinely part of that minority. We have a lot of the people now claiming to be this, that, and the other thing, identifying as this, that, and the other thing, will never undergo any of the actual, the psychological adaptation that has to come with this, but the physical change as well. That's that seems to be the least of things on the list these days. Well,
yes, and people like me who have made a reasonably, fairly adaptive change, we are now being demonized by certain parts as, and I'm not talking about the TERFs, the trans exclusion radical feminists, we'll leave them out for the moment. the trans rights activists are calling me true scum. This is their word for trans medicalists. So they say, oh, you're a trans medicalist. I'm saying, well, how else could you deal with this? But they say, well, they claim to be quite happy with their female-male bodies. This is, something I really don't understand, and something which was a big part of what triggered me into starting to look at this issue, 10 years or more ago.
I'd also refer listeners who are interested in these issues to my both my interviews with Norwegian author Bjorn Andreas Bull Hansen, but in particular the one, Masculinity is Not Toxic, because the toxic masculinity, this is another one of these weaponized phrases being thrown around in all of this, and I resent it deeply. Again, being lumped together in some kind of cliche. And cliches are cliches for a reason. They do come from somewhere, but they tend to oversimplify situations, massively, and they certainly can't be applied to everybody that people would like them to be applied to. And I also resent, the other flip side of toxic masculinity is probably some kind of toxic femininity. Some young woman who perhaps would really like to get married and have children and make a home or something, and that's all clearly oppressive in the language of the day. But again, it's about, well, that's not for everyone, clearly, and no one should feel that is their only choice. But for some people, it is a choice. And what I resent is the idea that under the toxic masculinity banner, any traditional male traits, and that will apply, by the way, to many gay men as well, not just heterosexual men, but that's being demonized, again, as oppressive, and what's being held up as evidence is rightly, not rightly held up as evidence, but it has been in the past, horror stories from history of male oppression of females and male oppression of other minorities and what have you. But again, it's just so black and white. And it's basically saying in order to right these injustices, which, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, have been lots of injustices of the past have gradually been improved with time, that this all has to be jettisoned in favor of, I'm not sure what, because as you point out, well, as the radical trans activists, the type we're talking about, as they themselves point out, they're offering something that is hollow and quote unquote without a core. So it's throw it all out and replace it with nothing.
Well, yeah. Gosh, I don't know where to start with this. I mean, there's a slightly tangential point that's come into my mind, and it won't leave me until I can say it. So, for instance, all this stuff about oppression and stuff. I mean, I think we have to accept that the world is a rough and ready place, and that the very comfortable, secure world that, we apparently live in many ways, but is becoming a little bit, which is turning out to be not quite so comfortable and safe as we thought it was, is only a very, very recent thing, and it's probably not going to last very long. So, for instance, now I seem to have a particular kick on at the moment reading early 20th century novels. Now, I seem to have come across a lot of old penguins by C.S. Forrester, who was the author of the African Queen, the famous Humphrey Bogart, Katharine Hepburn movie. And he describes a lot of 19th century and early 20th century very kind of masculine lives. And I find these very admirable because he talks about I'm absolutely overwhelmed by the way he describes the hardships that men have experienced in battles. I'm reading one of his stories about the First World War trenches at the moment. And I think to myself, well, these kind of hardships that men are so stoical about, we have to say, largely motivated by protecting their homes and their families and their women and their children, is this kind of world of hardship, which has kind of phased out over the last 40 years or so, is probably just lurking over the horizon. If our comfortable Western society were to fall. And I find some of the way that certain feminists speak about men, as you say, about toxic masculinity and so forth. Well, if we hadn't had toxic masculinity, we'd have probably been defeated by Napoleon or Hitler or the Kaiser or somebody like that. And this is its point. I mean, it's just utterly absurd to think that, millions of years of evolution have led to something so maladaptive and so hateful as we are being led to believe. It's ridiculous.
Well, I think a lot of the dysfunction in maleness or femaleness, in whether of whatever sexual persuasion, are down to other societal factors, cultural factors, and not just children's upbringing, but the wider sort of cultural milieu that they exist in, and that's been increasingly sort of a barren and very dark, destructive place towards the end of the 20th and into the first part of the 21st century. So, and I've spoken about this before, but I get from somewhere up at the top, when we say elites, at the point at which you can no longer identify or easily identify individuals or groups, you move up the pyramid of society, and when it becomes a bit hazy, from there seems to come this wider agenda, of which this trans thing is part, at its worst is part of this wider agenda to dumb people down and then to castigate them for it. Look at these, these pathetic creatures. They need to be controlled. They need to be directed. When you've done everything you can to make them like that.
Well, I can't help thinking about whether you're trying to lead me into mentioning that horrible person, Noah Yuval Harari, who talks about people like this. I mean, this dreadful quote of his recently, which says, what do we need 8 billion people for? Well, I'd say you don't need them. They need them for themselves. They are living human beings, incarnations of the spirit, and their life paths and their lives and their, values and everything, nothing to do with him. What right does he have to say? Plus, also, I would say, as far as resources, food resources particularly go, I'm quite convinced that this whole Malthusian famine kind of narrative that we're being led into about there's too many people, we've got to reduce the population stuff, is really, it's false, because we're seeing they're trying to get farmers to downsize their productions and stuff like that. So basically, if you just if the farmers were just to increase their production, reclaim land. I mean, look what Holland is one of the largest agricultural producers, not just in Europe, but in the world. I mean, it's a tiny little country. They've reclaimed a few hundred square miles of land and cultivated intensively, and it shows what can be done. If Libya were to use its massive underground water resources to reclaim and recultivate land, as I think they're probably doing a bit of that, then we could find the millions of square miles of agricultural land could be made available, and I'm quite certain that there's a lot of we see the troubles in the Ukraine, how the food supplies are just being deliberately disrupted, and I'm quite sure that we could support 10-20 billion people on this planet if we really put our minds to it and stop wasting all the resources on non-productive things like this. So I think I think we're being deliberately directed away from a mindset that can lead us to solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And what the wider topic that you've touched upon there to do with population and food supply, except we'll get onto that in more detail just in a little while. But what I wanted with Harari, when I watched the same video clips that you did, probably. I would like to have a how can I put it, a spirited debate with him.
Oh yeah.
But especially when I looked at this creature, and I don't care what people say, that that's what he struck me as like. He's one of these guys that got beat up at school, and I'll just say in advance of this that I despise bullies. It's one thing when I was at school, and I'm still to this day, I would despise bullies. If I got any agency or any power to to shut a bully down, and when I see that happening, I will do it.
Oh, good for you.
I absolutely despise that behavior. That said, what I wanted to do when I watched that video of his was punch him in the face, not beat him up, just punch him in the face, and just there you go. That's it. That's my comment on what you had to say. It's my review of your video.
Yeah, well, I would just say that obviously not all people who get beaten up at school because they are weak turn out to be horrible genocidal lunatics like him.
No, not at all. Far from it. In fact, some of the the people I know in my personal life have gone on to just do great things. Where we're in that environment, that could be quite. When I was at school, particularly in teenage years, it could be very competitive and aggressive. It could be the negative side of, and the girls would do this as well.
Oh yeah.
So you could see the negative. That's teenagers for you. The negative side of masculinity and femininity at work there for sure. I think that's partly what that competitiveness is partly about what growing up and finding yourself is, but of course it has a dark side and a dark expression.
Yeah, and part of growing up is learning to outgrow that spiteful 13-year-old aspect and gain more maturity and just human respect.
Part of what I see in this, and again, that the negative, the dark side of the trans agenda, and I see this in a lot of other similar movements and agendas that are moving us, in the same general direction, is, and particularly among younger generations who are part of it, and that tends to be young people that are getting sucked into this. Those of us that have been around the block a few times can tend to see things for what they are a little bit more, and it is a fear of responsibility actually. A lot of, as I said, it's throwing out traditional values and traditional institutions, whether cultural, social, replacing them with nothing, because then you're absolved from responsibility. You're taking responsibility for your life in some way, and also this impulse to destroy and not to create. It's so much easier to destroy than to create. Destroy things, whether literally, as we saw during some of the rioting during lockdown, or metaphorically destroy things, but not replace it with anything, because being creative, ultimately the ultimate act of creativity is creating a life, and ugliness is taking the place of beauty. Beauty is now seen as oppressive. Whatever your view of beauty is, whether it's in traditional art, that's then destroyed and replaced by modern art, and also ultimately about a lot of this. So much is about hate, but not love. It's not about what we love and what we want to create and how we see the future and what we will take responsibility for. It's just we hate this, we're destroying this, out with beauty, in with ugliness, anything goes and nothing matters.
Well, I'm reminded of, you probably know James Dellingpole. I follow his podcast, and he interviewed an artist a while back, and the artist said something like that. He said he was with a group of people, and there was this, blue-haired feminist, and he was talking about how he wanted to create art of beauty. And I think she said those exact words. Beauty is oppressive, or possibly something even worse than oppressive. And it's just, well, the human race has spent thousands of years trying to create objects of beauty, architecture, and so on and so forth, poetry, everything, and now all we're left with is the kind of things that find their way into the... I'm sure J.M.W. Turner would be appalled to find that his name is being used for some of these exhibitions. It's astonishing.
Well, a lot of the problem with the word beauty and other sort of positive, superficially positive affirmations is how materialist culture and consumer culture has sort of hijacked those terms. For example, we're talking, look at the cover of, let's take men's magazines, quote unquote, women's magazines, or magazines for gay men or gay women, whatever. So for decades, particularly post Second World War, but not exclusive to that, you had these idealized visions of men and women, which most people could never live up to, even if they wanted to. Physical ideas and having a certain life and a certain lifestyle, So it became that very narrow view. And of course, that, is contemptible. No one wants to look at this airbrushed blonde bimbo in the front of a magazine and imagine that all women want to be like that or should be like that. I don't even notice women like that. Honestly, they walk down the street. I don't even see them. I'm not interested. But if you want to be like that, it's fine. Knock yourself out. But the point is, it was a very narrow vision. So that's where, in some people's minds, I think the idea of beauty being oppressive comes from, because it's a marketed, mass-produced, packaged idea of beauty or any other descriptor.
Well, it's a commercialized commodity. And I was listening to a very interesting lecture by Dr. Jason Giorgiani recently, and he was talking about philosophy, trying to unify and all the different fields of philosophy, all the way from ontology, epistemology, ethics, and all these in the looking at the way that philosophy should subdivide or categorize reality, the universe, and experience. And beauty came into this as it was further down the categorizations than ontology and epistemology, but it's still a kind of quintessential part of it. Like a hologram, all parts of a hologram contain all parts of the image. And so beauty and rightness are things which are inherent. They are not things which are just kind of constructed ad hoc, And I think there are, objective standards. And obviously beauty, the thing is, one of my big things is that reality is like a fractal. It's always generating new stuff, but the new stuff always somehow has something in common with the old stuff, even though it's new. And this is like how, beauty can be reinvented and reinvented and reinvented, and yet it's always beautiful. And yet the moment it starts being ugly, everybody can tell.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizedfreedom.com.
legalizedfreedom.com